Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's Michigan's AutoTalk podcast. We remind you every episode of Michigan's AutoTalk podcast is about celebrating that thing with four wheels or, well, maybe more, the automobile, the truck, everything automotive. We're also about helping and supporting you, the great car and truck owners across the state of Michigan, birthplace of just about everything automotive. And of course, remember this podcast, all of our previous episodes, all 85 of them, you can get them on the iHeartRadio app, Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcasts, and of course on your smart speaker as well. Al Schwinkendorf, John Puhek are here, co-hosts for Michigan's Auto Talk podcast. I'm producer Phil Tower. And Al, this is all your baby. I'm going to let you take this away because we have a special guest tonight.
Okay, yeah. Because we're Michigan's Auto Talk. We all know Ford and Chevy and the Dodge brothers and stuff like that. But I was always curious about this little place in Kalamazoo called Checker Motor Cars. And I started doing a bunch of research on it and stuff. And the story just blew my mind. It's the best automotive story in the world, not just in Michigan. And the people that I sent an email to at the Checker Owners Club said, we know the man for this. They forwarded it to Jim Garrison, and he sends me back an email and he goes, I'm a former employee at Checker. I'm a former past president of the Checker Motor Car Club. I'm a restorer, a collector, and a history buff in general. So it's just like, here's our man. This is the deal.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on, Jim. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So what I kind of like to do is let you tell our listeners the short version of the big story of Checker, and then have you come back next month and in February and stuff and put in the details, because there's so many eras and different things that went down and stuff like that. But this is a company that it didn't necessarily start with them, but when it really got big, it was a Russian immigrant who got the thing in a freak kind of way, and his family was still in charge when it went under. It's crazy.
Well, it is a remarkable story. I'll try to be brief, but as you say, there's so many aspects of it and so many interesting sidelights. But in general, as you were describing, Checker was started by a Russian immigrant. His name was Morris Markin. He came to the United States in 1913 through Ellis Island, and he was penniless and he spoke no English. But fortunately, he had some relatives in Chicago, one of whom worked for a tailor. And Markin, a quick study and a dynamic guy, soon developed a talent for tailoring. And he worked in the tailor shop. He bought the tailor shop when the owner died. And then he landed a contract to make uniforms for the military. That's back in about 1916. And so he was fortunate to make a lot of money. He loaned some money to a gentleman named Lomberg, who had a failing auto body business. And when Lomberg couldn't pay him back, he took over the auto body business. He merged the company that was making mogul taxis for the Checker Taxi Company of Chicago, put the three of them together, and that's what started Checker Motors off in 1922.
I just got to break in here for a second, because here's a guy who, he didn't want to give that $1,500 to his brother, Russian immigrant. He's just like, oh man, I'm sitting here tailoring suits and I got some money, and this guy's got this big business is failing, but okay, I'll give it to him. And then like whatever it is, 6 months, a year later, whenever it is, he's just like, okay, I'm done. The company's yours. And now the guy's got to change his total mindset and everything he's doing in life, going, and this is what I think is cool about him. He could have just sold it off or done something like that, but he goes, yeah, I think I'll go do this and make it happen.
It is interesting. He was an ambitious young man, and he started with the taxi company there in Chicago. He soon started expanding it into other venues. They came out with new models during the 20s, and then they just kept on making reliable taxi cabs and spreading them throughout the country in cities, large cities at first, but then they started selling them even into smaller cities. And Checkers just became the iconic, recognized taxi cab throughout the country and in many places around the world. They're featured in movies now. And of course, we probably know that there is no more Checker Motors. It is went out of business in 2009, and now it's just part of history.
And I'm so glad, Alan John, I'm so glad that Jim said that, because I think a lot of people hear Checker, and let's face it, anybody who's probably under the age of 40 has no idea what a Checker is. And
it's a baby boomer thing.
Yeah, and so this was the quintessential taxi cab in the world, not just in North America, but in the world. When you went to hail a cab in any big city, this is what it looked like. It was a big, I don't want to say boxy, but it was a big, roomy sedan, huge back seat, vinyl seats. I can't remember, and Jim would know because Jim made them. Rubber floor, right? Yeah.
Yes, they did. They had those rubber floors, and they were made so that they could be washed out, because in any given day, a taxi driver might pick up anyone from the highest and the mightiest to the dregs of the earth, and one after another have to take them where they needed to go.
I had a friend that was in Cuba like a year and a half ago, and he said there's still Checkers that are down there acting as taxis, which I think is crazy.
It's amazing. I have heard that, but I've not seen photos of it, so I would be glad to see one if there is one out there.
And I will say, if you're a baby boomer, and my grandparents lived in South Bend, my grandfather worked for Studebaker, and we go down, and Grandma would put us on the South Shore train, and we go up to Chicago every year about this time, just before Christmas. Chicago was full of Checker cabs. They're freaking everywhere. And about a year ago, it was Father's Day weekend. We went to visit my son, who's in the Navy, who happened to be in Chicago for some schooling at the time. And Lyft and Uber is taking it all over. And the very few real cabs that are out there, especially the yellow ones with the little checker thing down the side, were mostly like Chrysler minivans and stuff. It's kind of sad.
There are all kinds of other cars that have had to take over, Crown Vics and Citations and things like that. But Checkers were the quintessential taxi cab, and they were the most beloved by people who had to go anywhere in a taxi. I like to describe them as big and round and bubbly and friendly.
Yeah. And Jim, these cars were known for their long life and their durability. Many of these cars racked up more than 400,000 miles.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, they would just go and go and go. What was the typical power plant in a Checker coming off the line?
They used industrial motors to begin with.
Well, actually, starting in 1965, they used the General Motors engines, and for a while, Borg Warner transmissions, then switched turbo 400s. And before that, before 65, they used Continentals, and I could go back further. But they were rugged vehicles. They were made to handle all of the road hazards that we're likely to come across in a big city, curbs and potholes and railroad tracks. And they just take all of that abuse very, very nicely. The thing about Checkers, though, is that while they did often get about 500,000 miles before they were retired, they were not very well rust-proofed. And so they would do well, at least in northern climates, for 5 or 7 years. And then they started to get pretty rickety. So it's the ones that were in private hands and down south that lasted longer.
Well, and they had, they were designed to be repaired and to continue on. And I saw this thing on TV 10, 15 years ago about this guy in New York who had a taxi company, and he bought up every Lincoln Town Car, Mercury Marquis, and Ford Crown Vic he could, and he have them disassembled so he had parts to keep his cabs going, because he said, I already went through this once with Checker. And then I learned about this repair situation going on in Chicago that was also owned by the same guy. That was their whole thing, was to keep the cabs up and running, and that's a phenomenal story all by itself.
Quite the case. Checkers were made to be quick to repair, easy to repair, and get them back out on the road and making money. That was the whole idea behind taxi cabs, and it was part of the charm of Checkers, I guess. And part of their downfall, because as fleet vehicles, not very many of them were sold to private citizens. But it's the taxi cabs that are now rare and hard to find, and it's the ones that were privately owned that people cherished and took good care of, and that are still around.
Yeah, and a lot of people customize those, and I've seen, Jim, I've seen station wagon versions of the Checker. Was that a factory option, or was that a custom deal?
It was a factory option. Checker made station wagons and other vehicles as well. In the last design, because from 1962 to about 1982, they changed relatively little in design, and so fenders from a 68 are interchangeable with fenders from a 77. But they made other vehicles as well. They did make the station wagons, as you mentioned, but they also made aero buses, which were 8-door long limousines that could handle 12 to 15 people.
Wow.
And they also made an odd vehicle called a Medicar back in 1969, which was designed to handle people in wheelchairs. It had a ramp that you could hook onto the side, and the roof was raised up, and the rear doors swung open 180 degrees, and you could just roll a wheelchair right up in them, lock them in place. And so it was always Checker's intention to serve public transportation needs. It's just that the taxi cabs were what everybody recognized. Yeah,
that's pretty amazing that they had an accessible vehicle when nobody thought about that stuff in 1969. One with a ramp. That's pretty amazing. Jim, did you ever get a chance to drive one?
Oh gosh, yes. I've driven. I own a 1980 that I drive around quite a bit. Still drive it. In fact, I drove it today.
Awesome.
And yep, there are others that driven. They're actually quite nice handling cars. They're fairly heavy, and on the highway they ride like a dream as long as everything is right and tight. And they're easy to work on. They have everything is accessible. It's fairly straightforward. They had regular carbureted engines, and they're pretty good to work on. And surprisingly, most parts are still available for them.
Wow. Could you fit?
Is yours a V8 or a V6?
Well, mine happens to be a little 229 V6, one of the punkiest little engines that Checker's ever got. But it also it'll get up to 80.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say it'll get up to 85
I shared this
eventually.
With Jim and not with. There you
go. Ahead.
I shared this with Jim, but not so much Phil and John. But in like 1982. We had a very flamboyant second generation steel company owner in Grand Rapids who went down they spent Christmas in Key West at their other home. And this guy got this idea talking to his friends that for her birthday coming up in January, he needed to get his wife a Checker because she had to run the kids back and forth to school because they were privileged and they couldn't ride the bus, So he went out and he got her one of the last of I think they were called A's if they were a passenger car. It's a Marathon. The long rear doors. It had opera windows in the back. It had a yellow vinyl roof, and it's a pastel yellow. And the whole car's yellow, and they put like GM wire hubcaps on it, fake wire hubcaps. It had a Chevy Monte Carlo steering column, and it had like a 3.8 Buick V6 in the thing, or maybe it was the Chevy version. I don't know. But that car was so much fun, and he got a license plate that says Mom's Cab, and she was like the talk of the country club because she'd go run the kids back and forth in this Checker cab, and she loved that thing. I mean, she had, a brand new 12-cylinder Jaguar, and she had a Mercedes for driving in the winter, and her favorite car was that old Checker, which was kind of clunky and funky. The front bumper looked exactly like the guardrail on the side of the highway, and it was so cool, and it was so fun to work on because it was like working on a car from the 50s. It's basic, simple.
Very true. And you mentioned that she loved the car. Well, the Checkers, if they're properly decked out, are really quite the limousines. In fact, there was a guy down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Marvin Winkoff, who saw checkers as something other than fleet cars. So he would do them up with a Landau top and an opera window and two-tone paint scheme and put on fancy wheels.
Probably where it came from.
Quite possibly.
Yeah. And Jim, what about the trunk
Crazy,
in a
crazy
checker?
stuff.
What about the trunk? It's got to be one of the biggest trunks ever made in a passenger car.
Well, I suppose there are others that compare, but Checkers did have a nice big trunk, and they could fit lots of luggage or whatever else needed to go in them. The spare tire, full size, goes back in the wheel well back there, so it's really made to accommodate a lot of room. And plus, quite often, well, when I travel in it, I just put the luggage in the back seat, and there's still room for passengers back there. It's a very spacious back seat.
I love it. I love it, love it, love it.
Are you a golfer? Jim, are you a golfer?
Not by interest. My father kept trying to get me into golf, and he said, geez, go ahead.
Well, no,
yeah,
I mean, Cadillacs and Lincolns in the 70s and 80s, they used to judge them by how many sets of clubs you could get in the trunk. And I think Checker next to a station wagon would probably beat them all.
Maybe. But they were very spacious in the trunk and in the back seat.
Okay, now, can we have you give us the end story of how it all wound down? Because I'm thinking that, knowing our listeners, because John and I have been doing this for years and years and years, and Phil too, we want to have you back, and because there's so many eras and so many cool things and so many things that Checker did that, you know, they weren't one of the big three, but they did awesome stuff that really stuck with us and changed the whole face of automobiles in America and the world. But just give us the rundown where this thing came to an end, and talk to us about that. And then, next couple months you can come back and fill in the middle.
Well, briefly, Checkers stopped making taxi cabs and passenger cars in 1982. And there are a variety of reasons. The dies were getting pretty old, and General Motors was somewhat reluctant to keep selling engines and transmissions to Checker. But the primary reason that I see Checker stopped making taxi cabs was because it was just more practical for taxi franchises, to buy mass-produced cars. The parts were more commonly available. It was newer stuff, more fuel efficient, and it just made better sense for them to buy other cars than Checkers. And that was not the end of Checkers. Okay. Contrary to popular belief, people seem to think that Checker went out of business when they stopped making taxi cabs, but that's not the case at all. For 27 years, Checkers did contract work making automotive parts like doors and fenders and hoods and tailgates and frame parts and things like that for General Motors primarily, and also for Ford and International Harvester and Chrysler on a smaller scale. But they stayed in business for 27 years as a world-class supplier of automotive parts. But then it just got to be difficult. And then when the depression of 2008 hit, those of us who were watching economic trends realized that Checkers didn't have a very likely future. And then they closed the doors in June of 2009.
What a history.
Jim, thanks you so much for coming on. We can't wait to have you back. Like I said, we have this small group of people who like to, they like us, and they like the podcast, and they like the feedback they get. So they come on, and they're like, what do we call them, our regulars?
Yeah.
And you should be a regular because you've just hit the very, very tip of this entire story, which the more I read about it, the more fascinated I am. So thank you very much. We look forward to talking to you in January, and really, really appreciate your time and expertise.
It's been my pleasure. Call back anytime.
Thank you.
Will.
We will indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Jim Garrison, you said, Al, he not only worked in the plant, he's a collector. He's just kind of he's a walking encyclopedia about
restorer, former president of the club. Yeah. He's the Checker dude. Yeah. And that's the gal at the Checker Club immediately sent her email to Jim and said, this is the guy you need to talk to. And when you get someone enthusiastic like that, one of the biggest groups of checkers is at the Gilmore. And when they have their club has a get together, they do it at the Gilmore. They don't have their own place. And I said, there's a good possibility, this summer we could do something down there and you should show up too. He goes, I do show up every couple times a year, and put this all together. That'd be fun. We could do something with the powers that be and then go do a checker thing at the Gilmore. How cool would that be?
That would be a lot of fun. All right, we're gonna put the wraps on episode number 86. We remind you, of course, check us out on Facebook. As Al said, we are growing the Michigan's Auto Talk podcast family. We have almost 200 of you liking our Facebook page. If you're listening and you haven't liked it, facebook.com/Michigan's Auto Talk. You can check out some great things on there, which we'll be talking about in some of our upcoming episodes. In the meantime, we're going to say goodbye and look forward to having you join us for our next episode. Until then, for Michigan's Auto Talk podcast, I'm producer Phil Tower.
I'm Al Schwinkendorf.
I'm John Puhek. Thanks for listening.